And we're back for another episode of TPS, the Productivity Show, the number one podcast on iTunes. We recently surpassed over 10 million downloads now, so I'm super proud to be co-hosting this podcast with Brooks Duncan. How are you today, Brooks?
I'm great. This episode is kind of a question, so I'm curious how much you and I will agree on this topic. Guess we'll have to stay tuned and see.
How many Pomodoros should you do in a day? I mean, we can end this podcast in 30 seconds, or we can kind of flesh it out and do like our usual 25 minutes. How about we shoot for 25 minutes just to keep it Pomodoro style today?
Sounds good. We'll do our best.
All right. So just in case you're brand new to the podcast, my name is Tam Pham. I'm the founder and CEO of Asian Efficiency, and Brooks is the COO of Asian Efficiency. And together we do this podcast. And one of the things we always like to do is start off with our top 3 resources right away. So you have some quick wins and resources you can use before we start diving into today's content. The first resource I would recommend for you to check out is an app called Focus Booster. So this is actually a timer app. You can use it as a way to force yourself to focus. But it can also track time. It can kind of give you pretty visual graphs of what you did over the last hour or over the last day or last week. So it's a great tool that I would recommend. I've recommended this a lot in my presentations as well. As the second one is, again, in the spirit of the whole Pomodoro technique, which is today's topic, you don't have to install a separate app, right? I like Focus Booster because it has like a lot of pretty graphs, but you can just use your iPhone or an Echo or your Google device. Any type of device that you probably already have can be used as a timer, right? So use what you have. You don't have to buy something fancy or separate. Oftentimes I just use my iPhone as a timer as well. So it's something you want to consider. But as a third resource, I know many of you are people who love to touch things, are very ecstatic about a lot of different things, and you care about aesthetics. And so if that is you, you want to check out the Essington Glass Timer. So this is kind of like a sand timer, specifically designed around productivity, but it has like different colors of sand that you can use, like copper or gray or black, and has like different times of like 25, 50 an hour and so on. So it's one of the most pretty sand hourglass timers that I've seen, and we've partnered up with them in the past before. So definitely check out Essington Glass Timer, and we'll have links to all of this in the show notes as well. So you can always go to theproductivityshow.com/361. So Brooks, what do we have in store for today?
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about basically what you should shoot for when it comes to the Pomodoro technique. But of course, we need to talk about what the Pomodoro technique is and why you would want to do it. The Pomodoro Technique, which we'll dive into some of the mechanics in a minute, but basically where this episode will be helpful is if you find it hard to get started on a task. A lot of us suffer from this. We just find we know what we need to do, but we find it so hard to actually take that first step and get started. Even if it's important, you end up getting distracted by just distractions or busy, or you spend your time with busy work. The Pomodoro technique can really help you get started. Maybe you feel like you're not getting enough done. Even if your workday is full, you just feel guilty that you didn't do more. Or maybe your day is structured pretty well, but you want to see if you can optimize some more. And hopefully this episode will give you some tips on how to do that in a more kind of structured way. Next week, we always like to shout out what's coming up next. The next week is going to be a very interesting and different episode than what we've done in the past. We just hit a pretty major milestone on the podcast, which we'll talk about next week. So we thought we would go behind the scenes, how the productivity show gets made, the equipment we use, the process we use, how it all works together. So we've had a lot of questions on that. Whenever we do a Q&A, we get a lot of questions about how the podcast actually works. So we're going to be doing a behind the scenes next week for that. I'm really, really looking forward to that. And the reason why the Pomodoro technique is so helpful is because chances are, if you think about everything that you do in a day, you probably don't get as much done as you think. You know, maybe you go to the office or you log in at your computer from home and you've got meetings, you've got emails, you've got Slack chats or Microsoft Teams. Maybe you're texting somebody, maybe you're checking out some social media. You probably don't make a huge amount of meaningful progress on your most important work during the day. You might you might feel busy, and at the end of the day you might be like, oh man, today was crazy, but the actual focus work that you did might have been minimal at best. And so the Pomodoro technique is a surprisingly simple technique that can help. And the reason we like it is because it's so simple. Sometimes the most effective techniques are the most simple ones. It's just a matter of actually doing them. And that's what we're going to get into today. So Tan, maybe you can introduce, for those who don't know, some will be familiar, but maybe need a refresher. Maybe you can talk about, we're going to be talking about the Pomodoro technique today. Maybe you can introduce what the Pomodoro technique is and how it works.
Yeah, so I've been teaching this for over a decade now, and I first discovered the Pomodoro technique back in early, like 2008, 2009 maybe. And it's a really popular time management method that basically works like this. You have to figure out what's the one task that you are going to work on. Then what you do, you set a timer for yourself for 25 minutes. And during this set time, the only thing you can do is work on this one particular task, right? And once the timer goes off, you have to stop working. You take a 5-minute break, and then you repeat the same cycle all over again. So you set the timer for another 25 minutes. And then if you finish your task, great, you move on to the next one. But if you didn't finish your task when the timer went off, you just continue until the timer goes off again, right? And so that is the basic principle of the Pomodoro technique. And now there's a lot of, fable mystery around like who actually created it. Like if you look on Wikipedia, it will say that Francesco Cirillo created it, and Pomodoro is the Italian word for tomato. And so hence you see a lot of like tomato timers out there if you look for the Pomodoro technique or Pomodoro timer, right? But I've also seen some rumors that this was just purely fabricated as a story, and it's actually just made up, because if you look at the trademark, there's actually a trademark for the Pomodoro technique. Hence, we're not associated with them. We're just, talking about it as a concept here. You start to kind of question it. Like, is this actually a real thing, or is this actually like a commercial thing that someone has made up? So either way, it doesn't really matter for you and I, because when you implement the strategy, it actually is very effective. I find this to be the most effective strategy for overcoming inertia or overcoming procrastination. If I have a hard time getting started on something and I set a timer for myself, it's almost like 95% success rate that I will get started. And usually because I got started, things will usually get done. And so if you want to start diving deeper into the Pomodoro technique, we have a free guide on our website. You can go to asianefficiency.com/Pomodoro-technique. We'll have a link to it in the show notes as well. So don't worry if you can't get there right now. But that's the basics of the Pomodoro technique.
Now, I have a question, and this is a question that comes up quite a bit. So if you're listening to this podcast, you might have this question in mind as well. Is there something magical about this 25 minutes and 5 minutes? Like, do you have to stop at 25 minutes? Could you maybe do 40 minutes? Or what if you're going along and you're just in the zone? You're working on your stuff, you're making progress. Finally, you're actually doing the thing that you're supposed to be doing. Do you have to stop? What's your thinking around the rigidity of the Pomodoro technique?
Yeah, so first of all, I didn't create the technique, right? So this is something that someone else created. And so I can only speak to my own personal experience and to the experience I've had with working with people on this. So my take on this is that 25 minutes is a long enough time period to get something meaningful done, but it's also short enough for you to feel like it's not forever, right? Like if you have to say to yourself, I have to focus for the next hour, that can be kind of stressful for a lot of people, and it can kind of cause anxiety for some as well. Whereas committing to focusing for just 25 minutes feels like, oh yeah, that was actually accomplishable, right? It's not even 30 minutes, not even half an hour, like something that we can associate and naturally think about. 25 is kind of like an odd number in a way. So it's kind of hard to associate what that actually feels like for most people. And so I think most people find that it's relatively easy to get to 25 minutes of focus time, right? So I think that's one of the reasons it's so powerful, is to say, all right, let's do this for the next 25 minutes. And when you commit to just doing that, you have kind of like an excuse to say, okay, if I don't like it, I'm just going to quit after 25 minutes. But what you oftentimes find yourself in is you go into it And then by the time the timer goes off, you're like, oh my gosh, like, I can't believe I got started. I actually want to continue now and actually finish it, right? So then the question then begs, is 25 minutes the mark where you have to stop? And I would say if you are brand new to productivity, I think it would be helpful just to stop at 25 minutes, take a 5-minute break, and then repeat that cycle again. However, if you are someone who has made it a pretty good habit to do the Pomodoro technique pretty consistently, I would say like bump up that timer number. So you maybe set it to 30 minutes, to 35, to 50, 45, or whatever works best for you, right? So I've tried a lot of different time periods. And the sweet spot for me nowadays is like 15 minutes. So 50. So that way I will set a 50-minute timer, and then I'll take a 10-minute break, and then I'll do it again, right? And now that took me a while to kind of work my way up to there, right? Like I also wasn't at a certain point in time where I set it just for 10 minutes and then took like a 5-minute break, right? But that was just again, I'm just tricking my brain in a way just to get started. So don't feel guilty if you work on something and a timer goes off at 25 minutes. So you go, oh my gosh, like I want to keep going. At the end of the day, what's most important is that you get your stuff done, right? Like the outcomes are being hit, you are getting closer to your goals, whatever you have to do to get there, do that, right? Because what the Pomodoro technique is really helpful for, and this is what I believe is like the underlying mechanics that makes it so powerful, is for you to get started. And most of us struggle with getting started. So if you have to trick yourself into thinking that I just have to do this for 10 minutes, then do that, right? And if the timer goes off at 10 minutes, then you can decide what you want to do next. But when you make such a small commitment, it makes it easier for you to trick yourself to say, okay, let me do this.
This is something we talk about on the podcast a lot. And I think it's really, really important to kind of internalize in that there's so many like productivity techniques and systems, whether it's the Pomodoro technique, GTD, 12-week year, whatever it is, most important task, eat your frog, like all this stuff. So many things out there, but you shouldn't really be beholden to any of them. It's really important to adapt it to whatever works for you and helps you get things done. So I like your idea of having a context from anywhere from 10 minutes to 50 minutes to whatever works for you. That's the important thing, not like dropping your pencil at 25 minutes as if you're on like a baking show or something like that. All right, so let's talk about some of the things we use the Pomodoro Technique for. And the best thing about the Pomodoro Technique is that anybody can use it for pretty much anything. If there's anything you want to get done, just set a timer and get going on it. So it could be like work projects that you need focus on. It could be work projects that maybe you're procrastinating. It could be home chores. It could be getting organized. Recently in TPS361, so a few weeks ago, we talked about organizing that backlog of files you might have or cleaning up your desktop or downloads. Pomodoro Technique is great for these things that we kind of know we should do, but don't really want to do. You can just set a Pomodoro and you're going to get at least 25 minutes worth of that done. For me personally, using the Pomodoro Technique, I primarily use it for work focus projects. I have when I was creating or at least starting the show notes for this episode, I actually had a Pomodoro going as I created them. So for the parts of my job and the work that I do that require creativity, I don't know about you, Tam, but I personally have a massive ability to procrastinate and drag my feet. You were talking about how it's so powerful for getting started. That is exactly what I use it for, because I know I will find any excuse possible not to get started on something. So the Pomodoro saves me all the time. And that's primarily where I use it for. How about you, Tam?
I'm a poor starter, but I'm a great finisher. And I know that you've heard me say this many times, and people on the team know this as well. If anyone can help me get started on something and they can maybe do the initial 10% or 20%, I'm great at like doing everything else. So I have a hard time just getting started at things in general, because I have to do more research. I have to figure out like what's the ideal situation and context to do this and so on. Like I definitely overthink most of the time. And so I find it so helpful just to, as a way to just trick myself to get started on something. So one of the things I despise doing is checking email. And so I use it all the time for processing email, right? So I'll set a timer for 25 minutes, and that's my boundary for dealing with email. And I know that's like okay, I can do 25 minutes. It's not too long. It's not too short. I can get a lot of emails done in 25 minutes, right? And my goal literally for the whole day is like deal with all emails in 25 minutes or less. So if the timer goes off and I'm, finishing up an email, I'll finish it up. And then I'm like closing my email inbox and then I'll just get back into it tomorrow again, right? So I'm just forcing myself just to, one, also to cap myself to do something that is quote unquote like not super important. Like checking email is not the most important thing for me, because I could easily spend an hour or two in there if I really wanted to. But by capping it at 25 minutes, I now make sure that I have a boundary in place so that I can start working on the other things. Because again, our time is limited, our energy every single day is limited as well. So I want to have something to protect that. So I use that in that strategy as well. But again, the most powerful thing for me, again, is just forcing myself to get started.
Yeah, like we record these podcast episodes live with the Dojo and our TPS Plus members, which are our premium version of the podcast. And in the live stream, Connie says that she uses the Pomodoro to wash the dishes and clean the kitchen, especially when I'm tired. So she probably doesn't feel like cleaning the kitchen at that time, but she knows it's something that needs to be done. So Pomodoro it up. And I like the way that you do it 10. Usually we think of the Pomodoro technique as a way to get started and get things done, but you actually almost go the opposite way where you use it as a boundary for stopping. And if after 25 minutes you decide that you want to keep going at email, then you can take a break and go. But at least you have that boundary where you're going to make that decision, and then you can move on to other important things throughout the day. I like that. All right, so let's talk about some of the ways that you can get the most out of the Pomodoro technique. So like we said, you can use it for pretty much anything that you need to do or you need to put boundaries around, like we said. But there's some things that you can do to make it more successful, because this is something we hear quite a bit is people say, oh, I tried the Pomodoro technique, but it just didn't work for me. So we have some tips for helping you make the most out of the Pomodoro technique. And one of the biggest ones for me is to break down big tasks into smaller ones. This is something we've talked about on the podcast quite a bit, is you're much more likely to take action on something if it's broken down to something meaningful and manageable. And this is so true with the Pomodoro technique, because the more you break them down, the more you can easily take action. So you might have on your task list something like work on implementation project. That's not a great task to use with the Pomodoro technique, because it could just be anything. It could just be, first of all, it could be something that takes longer than that 25 minutes. But second of all, it's not specific enough. So maybe a better one would be create agenda for implementation project kickoff meeting. That's something you can really like grab onto and work on in your Pomodoro. And if it takes less than 25 minutes, then you can move on to the next thing. But at least that's something that you can kind of like grab onto. So that's the first tip: break down larger tasks into smaller ones whenever possible. The second one is to group tasks together. So when you're planning your day, you're looking at what's going to be happening throughout the day. Maybe there's a bunch of like smaller tasks that can be broken into less than 25 minutes. You could group them together and just do one Pomodoro where you're going to knock off these smaller tasks that we might otherwise procrastinate on. You can have a Pomodoro set aside just to knock those smaller tasks off. So group like or smaller tasks together into one Pomodoro. And then the third tip, and this is the biggest one, is to remove distractions. It's really easy to start a Pomodoro timer. All you have to do is click or tap start, but it's not so easy it's not magic, right? That doesn't automatically make you focus on the task at hand, especially if there are distractions. So back in TPS 359, which is just 2 episodes ago, we talked about how to overcome distractions and boost your attention. So if you haven't listened to that episode, we'll have links to it in the show notes, but highly recommend that you check out that at theproductivityshow.com/359. And so some tips that we gave there is to use focus blockers, kill notifications, use focus signals to others. However you need to do it to remove distractions, it makes it much more likely that you're going to be successful with your Pomodoro. How about you, Tan? Do you have any big tips for being successful with the Pomodoro technique?
I think the most important thing is identifying the one thing you're going to work on. So sometimes that does require for you to break things down, right? And if if I don't know what the first step is, it's oftentimes too difficult for me to get started. And this is where the Pomodoro technique can be helpful as well. But if you want to, again, make it even more powerful, just knowing what the first step is will make it a lot easier to get started. So for example, instead of saying, oh, I'm going to redo my closet, right? That's like an outcome or even like a project in a way. But if you said to yourself, you know what, for the next 25 minutes, I'm just going to pull out all my shirts out of my closet. Like that's all I'm going to do and reorganize them. Then that's something that's a little bit more concrete and actionable and something that you can take action on right away, right? And then if you can get really clear on what that first step is, again, not just in the context of the Pomodoro technique, but just in productivity in general, it will make things so much easier for you to get started. So really think about what's the first step that I can take, and the easier it is, the better.
In the live stream chat, Joel and Phil are having a good discussion about the concept of using rewards. So maybe once you finish that 4 Pomodoro cycle and you take a longer break, maybe you can have a reward tied to that, and then it can kind of help you keep going. So that's another great tip as well. All right. So back in the top 3 resources, Tan, you mentioned some apps and tools that you can use for keeping track of the Pomodoro. It really does not have to be anything high tech if you don't want. Like you said, it could just be a timer on your phone, but it could even be a simple physical timer. Like the famous version is just a tomato timer. We in the show notes to this, the productivityshow.com/361. We'll list a bunch of different apps, but you can have and tools. You can have an app on your phone like Focus Keeper, like you mentioned. There's web-based versions, like there's one called Pomodoro, which we linked to. On your computer, I've used Be Focused for a long time on my Mac, but also Focus Booster has a Mac Windows and mobile version. There's Chrome plugins like Marinara and physical timers like Essington Glass, and just any sort of anything that can count down, you can basically use as a timer. The key for me, this is me personally, is to use something simple. The more bells and whistles it has, the less likely, in my opinion, you are to use it. The more likely you're going to be fiddling around with stuff and it's going to become distracting. For me, it should be really, really super simple to start and stop it. For me personally, what I've started to do, like I said, I used to use an app called Be Focused, but right now I have a tool called a Stream Deck, which I've talked about in previous episodes, and I just have a button on it that starts and stops a countdown timer, and that's what I've been using for my Pomodoro. So no apps to fool around with. It's just literally pressing a button on my desk. How about you, Tan? What do you personally use for doing Pomodoro timing?
Personally, I use the Echo now. So I used to use my phone before, and sometimes I still use my phone just because I can kind of like call it through my voice. In the past, I did use Vitamin R, which is also mentioned here in the live stream as well. So the beautiful thing about Vitamin R, which is only really available on the Mac, is that it has a native integration with OmniFocus, which, as many of you already know, is my default go-to task manager. So you can actually integrate the two so that when you start a Pomodoro timer and you finish it, you can check it off in Vitamin R, and it will also be checked off in OmniFocus as well, and it has some visual data tracking and so on. So if you're in the camp of you're using OmniFocus and you want to have it integrated with your timer, like Vitamin R is really powerful, which is something we haven't mentioned, but we can add here as well. But it's such a small niche, right? So we want to make sure we have everything covered here. So again, if you miss any of the stuff that we just mentioned, just go to the show notes. You'll see all the links that we mentioned in there.
All right, so let's tackle this topic of how many Pomodoros should you do in a day. And this is one area where people really get into trouble with the Pomodoro technique too, is they think to be productive, they need to do a huge number of Pomodoro sessions to have been really productive. Like we said, you think about that 8-hour workday. Did you really work the full 8 hours in focus work? Probably not. And theoretically, in an 8-hour workday, you could do, say, 16 Pomodoros, but that's likely not going to be sustainable for pretty much anybody. Some people might do it occasionally if it's crunch time or whatever, but usually that's not a very sustainable goal because the number of Pomodoros you could do in a day really depends on so many things, the nature of your work, how draining it is, the unavoidable distractions around you. This is a big one. How many meetings you have to go into, your coworkers, maybe if you're working from home, your kids, other responsibilities you have going on during the day. And so there's so many factors that can go into it. But I'm curious what your thought is, Tan. How many Pomodoros should somebody shoot for in a kind of like sustainable way? And how do you kind of like take that plus and minus?
Yeah, so I would say the gold standard is 4 Pomodoros in a day. So that is 4 times 25. So that's 100 minutes of focus time when you think about it, right? So it's roughly a little bit more than an hour and a half, or an hour and 40 minutes. If you can do that every single day, that would be considered a productive day. And I think for most people that I've seen and have worked with, even getting to 2 Pomodoros, so that's 50 minutes, like 50, that is already a challenge. So if you find yourself already way behind, it's kind of hard to work your way up to 4 Pomodoros, within a week, right? So if you're in that camp, I would say shoot for 2, because at a bare minimum, I think regardless of your job, your role, and so on, anyone should be able to do 2 Pomodoros in a day. If you cannot have 2 Pomodoros in a day, you're really not being productive. You're just being busy. Okay. So again, 2 Pomodoros in a day is like the bare minimum. The gold standard would be 4, in my opinion. And anything above that is extra time, or it's just bonus. Okay. So for me personally, I'm always shooting for 4, right? Or in this case, 2, in the sense that I use a 50-minute cycle. But for most of you, I would recommend like aim for 2 first, right? So 2 times 25 minutes, and then work your way up to 4 times 25 minutes. And once you can kind of get that consistently in a groove, I'm guaranteeing you'll be the top 10% of the most productive people in your company, organization, or in your family, because you can get a lot of stuff done in a little bit over an hour and a half of just uninterrupted focus time.
Yeah. And you got to remember that 2 Pomodoros or 4 Pomodoros doesn't sound like a lot if you say it in the context of an 8-hour workday. But you got to remember that doesn't mean you're only working for that 80 minutes a day or for that length of time for four Pomodoros a day, because like we said, there's so much else going on. Like, for example, we're recording this podcast now, and I don't have a Pomodoro going because we're recording the podcast, but it is something focused I'm doing and something important to my day I am doing. But when I do set up a Pomodoro, it is for those real, like, creative focus time. So you want to make sure that the things you're setting your Pomodoro, you're not just setting a Pomodoro just to like do busy work, because that means that's time tracking. Essentially, we're not talking about time tracking. We're talking about real meaningful work that you're doing that will move you forward in whatever it is towards your goals. That's what we're talking about, those Pomodoros. And the more you can do the focus work in that Pomodoro time, the better off you'll be. Even if you need to start it at 1 or 2, hopefully 2, and then go up from there. All right, Tan. So if somebody wants to get started with this, maybe they've tried the Pomodoro technique in the past, it didn't quite work, or maybe they have never tried it and if this sounds great to them, they wanted to give it a try, or they want to start aiming for that 2 to 4 Pomodoro time. Where should people get started? What next action should they take?
Yeah, as always, we want to make things simple and actionable for you. So if you made it this far, what I would recommend is, if you've never tried the Pomodoro technique or you're brand new to it, give it a try today. Just use your phone or whatever time you have access to right now. Don't worry about the tools. Just set a timer for 25 minutes and set a goal to do 2 of them. See if you can accomplish 2. If you are someone listening who has already implemented in the past and kind of has done it on and off, start picking it up again and see if you can hit 4 Pomodoros in the day. Make that a goal for yourself, and maybe have a nice reward or treat at the end as well to make it even extra more motivating for yourself. Okay. So do that. And I'm pretty sure you're going to be so much more productive than you are right now. Again, next week's episode is all about the behind the scenes of how we do the productivity show. So if you want to know how we do things and how we create the content and how we publish things and all the numbers behind the podcast, you definitely don't want to miss out on next week's episode. And again, if you want to get all the links that we talked about today, be sure to go to theproductivityshow.com/361 and you'll find links in there in our show notes. So thank you again for being here today, and we'll see you next Productive Monday.